Welcome to the Jesus discussion. Often when we bring up the subject of Jesus, we first want to spend our time trying to figure out where everyone's coming from before we actually, hear from each other. Are you an evangelical, a Protestant, a Catholic, born again, saved? What is your angle of approach to this discussion? And we kind of filter what we hear from where we perceive people to be, coming from in their angle of approach. For me, my angle of approach, I don't really care what camp I'm in or what people call me. I'm just trying to live with a definitive goal, a definitive mark on the horizon, that the Jesus from the first century is the Jesus that I'm trying to live like, that's the person that I'm trying to model with my life. So it becomes highly relevant answering this question: who was Jesus? I didn't always have that aspiration to live like Jesus. I grew up within Christianity and I thought, well, maybe Jesus isn't for me. And then in my early 20s, I ran across some people who did really remarkable and selfless, just kind things for me. And when I asked them why, they said, because of Jesus. And it made me think, maybe Jesus isn't who I thought he was. Now, you may be listening to this and thinking that, Jesus has always worked for you. If you always had a positive experience with faith, your faith or spirituality has always been a relatively good thing. But what if someone near you is thinking, maybe Jesus isn't for me? I know if you and I were living a life that was exactly 100% like Jesus and someone didn't like that, well, that would be okay. It just means they don't like Jesus. But I know I'm not perfect. I know I'm doing some things that are pretty good and some things that are not really representative of who Jesus was. And so I have to deal with this problem. I'm confronted with this issue. Am I just going to live what faith works for me and define Jesus as whatever works for me? Or am I going to challenge some of my misconceptions and maybe some of my own imperfection as it relates to Jesus and try and live a better expression and a better understanding of who Jesus is? But how would I go about that? Well, at some point, we would want to go back to these ancient discussions about who Jesus is, what these first followers were trying to say. Yet, this is where the conversation gets really complicated, because when we look at these ancient records, we have 2,000 years of debate over what they mean. And it's kind of like we approach this squiggly bit in the sand, and we approach it from different angles, and we stand on either side of it and argue whether it's a 6 or a 9 all day long. And we never actually take the time to stand back and observe how we've approached the discussion differently. It's really easy for us to make Jesus out to be someone who wants the things that we want, as opposed to trying to challenge our own personal aspirations and desires and try and conform them to this ancient Jesus. Depeche Mode had that song, Your Own Personal Jesus. And it's really easy for us as people to try and, to bring Jesus along with us instead of head over to where Jesus is and try and conform to that. And so we have this bias that we have to deal with. And then we have to go back into this ancient discussion and understand what these people were trying to communicate. Who were these people and what were they saying? And what was the setting that they were speaking within? What was going on around them that made them say some of these things? When we come back, we're going to look at some of these ancient writings and try and understand maybe some of the bias that we carry as we approach this ancient culture. And as we understand these ancient conversations and the setting that surrounded this ancient discussion. And hopefully that helps inform our answer to the age-old question, who was Jesus? Welcome back to the Jesus discussion, and I'm here with my co-host Everett, and we talked a little bit about kind of getting past our bias and trying to understand this ancient culture. And Everett, I look at it a little bit like, maybe if I was going to go to a foreign country, travel overseas somewhere, and I really wanted to understand who those people were, so I didn't say and do some things that were, a little bit ridiculous in their culture. And I know, one of the things you've always said to me is that it's a little bit like listening to one half of a phone conversation, reading these ancient documents. So what are maybe some of the just basic things we want to be aware of before we just start reading?
Well, one of the things maybe is that we have to remember that Jesus was a real historical character who lived in a place and a time and a historical setting. There were things going on all around him. He had a history that led up to who he was and, his life and his work. And we tend to treat Jesus, even though a lot of us say, yes, I believe that Jesus was a real person, that he really was God incarnate, and lived in the first century and so on. We tend to make Jesus out to be who we want him to be. And in order to understand what Jesus is all about and what these ancient authors are saying, we have to remember that, and that as we approach these books, we have to remember that there are language issues, there are settings, sort of current event settings that are going on, and we have to approach it and let the text speak for itself and not try to force any meanings on it.
Right. And that can be really difficult. If you've opened up these ancient texts, you've seen these chapter headings and these verse numbers and various things like that. And you might have a copy of a collection of these 66 ancient writings, in some kind of study Bible. And so then there's additional commentary. So one of the things we have to remember is, those numbers were put in much later so that we didn't have to count in and go, in the third paragraph of that one letter in the second sentence, that we'd had a quick reference to reference a point because it's such a large body of work.
Right. And we're used to people writing things with things like word breaks and paragraphs set off and so on. The ancient writers didn't do that. They just wrote it down. And all of the paragraph breaks and all of that, the numbers, the little headings, the explanatory notes in study Bibles, all of that is something that people have added later.
Right. So sometimes those can be really helpful, but sometimes those reflect a certain view. And if you go through certain points of history, you can find a certain culture who had a certain view on a passage, and all the notes are going to reflect their view. And then just 100 years later, you look at some notes and they reflect a different view. So sometimes it's good to just kind of set that stuff aside and just kind of get back to this. Now, what we're going to look at is the Gospel of Mark, or the Good News of Mark. And in this Greek language, it was just words run together with no spacing. That there's no punctuation mark in the Greek. There's none of these extra commas, exclamation points. And so a lot of that was put in, that ancient people caught things like that in the meaning, but it was because it was their language that they spoke. not because there was punctuation there. There's another problem that we deal with when we talk about the notes. There's also the issue of translations. Maybe you want to explain a little bit about, why there are different translations and the spectrum of what these translations are.
The books that are collected in what we call the New Testament, those were written in, for the most part, just the common everyday street language of the people. It wasn't especially formulated language. It wasn't exceedingly complex. It was meant to communicate to just everyday people. And so translations have been done over the years that put the language, or translated the language into speech that people can understand. And there have been a lot of them done over the years in all kinds of languages, obviously. We'll focus on English because I don't know about you, but I can't read Russian. I can't even read French or German. So it's kind of handy that people have created these English translations. And one of the myths about translations, if I could take a second to do this, one of the myths about translations is that the older English translations are closer to the source, and therefore they're more reliable. But the truth is that more recent translations are based on, in some cases, in many cases, on more ancient manuscripts that have been discovered since those translations have been done. So if I could pick on the King James or the Authorized Version, and by the way, it's an okay translation. If you can get through the these and the thous and couldsts and all that, if you can get through that, it's a reliable translation. So we talk about different translations. We simply talking about trying to make the language understandable to contemporary people.
Right. If you think about, if you didn't speak Italian and you had a friend in Italy, and every week you had a chat with them and you paid a translator, if you had a different translator every week, they might turn different phrases a little bit differently when they change them over into English. But it wouldn't necessarily be a different meaning. And yeah, so when you look at these, sometimes it's just good to look at a few different translations. Just, if you find yourself kind of looking at a phrase and scratching your head, what does that mean? You can kind of see how some other people have kind of converted that phrase over into our language and maybe get a little better sense of what's being said. Now, this is different than a paraphrase. Whereas a translation, it's translating the word, whereas a paraphrase would be someone who just kind of listened to the whole conversation and summed it up in their own words.
Right, and most paraphrases are done from translations. So most paraphrases are not based on the oldest manuscripts we have available. They're based on some contemporary English version.
Right. Now, when we're getting at the question of who is Jesus, and for me, as I said in the intro, I'm trying to follow this ancient Jesus, the one who came in the first century. That getting back to this original discussion is actually just really valuable. And we have, whereas something like Plato, the earliest manuscripts, closest to the original manuscripts we have are somewhere from the 900s or so. But these ancient manuscripts, it seems like every time someone digs in that region of the world, they find another little corner or copy or bit of a manuscript. And so the really cool thing is that they all say the same thing. And so we've found copies that, date somewhere around the 90s CE. So, maybe even a second or third generation copy of the originals, or, maybe a little further, but still, that they all kind of say the same thing. So when we're getting at who is this ancient Jesus, we've got a lot of really reliable sources, and then we've got these translations that we can look at. Is there anything else that we need to really consider before we just open up a section of Mark and start reading?
I think besides language, the most important consideration as we look at these books is what was going on at the time, what had gone on before, and how are these people, reacting and responding in ways that made sense within that sort of cultural context in which they lived. So one of the things we want to do as we go through, the good news according to Mark, is we'll see little phrases and we'll say, well, what did that mean to the people who were reading it for the very first time?
Right. What would it be like to sit and listen to someone read in my community that, these letters in this ancient world? It wasn't like you could just go to the bookstore and pick up a copy of, Harry Potter and read it for yourself. Books were not necessarily, if you think about it, they had to be manually copied. So,
which made them very expensive and very rare.
Yep. Yeah. So, which also really kind of makes it pretty remarkable that there were so many of these copies, that so many have still existed so close to the source of these 27 documents in the New Testament here. So likely a community would share a copy. And you might hear it read aloud in your community. And so what would it be like to just sit and hear this in your own language, in your own culture said to you? And how can we kind of travel back in time and just be one of those people sitting there hearing this freshly? It also speaks to this early community of faith that there on some level had to be a considerable amount of literacy for these people to be able to write and copy as much as they did. And oftentimes we look at ancient people and we can think that they were less intelligent than us because they didn't have computers. They didn't have the internet. They're not as smart as us. They didn't go to this major university. But when you actually look at these ancient cultures, there were some pretty brilliant people. When you look at accomplishments like the aqueduct, or the Roman Emperor Nero built a statue that was just like 8 feet shorter than the Statue of Liberty out of bronze. It's where the Colosseum gets its name. It's called the Colossus.
Common people, we tend to look back through history and say, oh, those poor simple people, they weren't very sophisticated, but they lived close to the land, and they were very practical people, and most of them spoke at least 2 languages. So when we look back at those people, we shouldn't see, these poor simple shepherds that just weren't very smart. They were some extremely intelligent people.
Right. And we have to think about, Einstein wasn't a computer programmer. In our day, there's a lot of computer programmers. So, your intelligence resembles what, your knowledge resembles what you spend your time with. And so they would have spent their time with and probably known a lot more information about a lot of different things that aren't necessarily values for us in our time. So yeah, that's part of our bias that we're trying to get over is to just move past this idea of the ancient mind as a simplistic person that just really sees and in simplistic ways, but they had a diversity of life and a diversity of culture and experience, knew at least a couple languages. And, for them to survive, they couldn't, you couldn't just go to work and pick up a paycheck for not producing something. I mean, it was more likely that if you're going to survive, you actually had to be able to accomplish something. So that one guy in your office, or that one person in your office that is just shoveling paper all day long, and everyone kind of rolls their eyes. Less likely that you're in the ancient world and you're not actually adding value on some level, or at least capable of taking care of yourself in a kind of more cutthroat environment than we're used to experiencing in the modern world, especially if you live in a first world country. So is there anything else that we really need to look at when we get into this opening part of Mark here?
I think we're going to discover a lot as we go. So
okay, great.
Maybe we can get started on the first part of the first chapter after the break. Huh?
Welcome back. Now, we're just going to start with this opening chunk of Mark, and why we're breaking down these passages. The way we're breaking down these passages is because, as these ancient authors wrote in these what are called the four Gospels, Mark and Matthew and Luke and John, those writings, that there was likely at their time lots of stories going around about Jesus. And so they chose their specific stories, their specific things that they're saying in order to convey their point. So they might be coloring the story of Jesus. They're not saying anything different or anything conflicting with each other, but they're pointing to something with a little bit of dimensionality. It would be one thing to describe a sculpture from one side and then to turn around and go to the other side and describe the sculpture. It's clearly the same thing. The object of what you're describing is not changing, but how you're describing it is a little bit different because you're pointing out a different aspect of it and highlighting a different aspect.
As we read any ancient work, but as we read Mark's text, there's really two things that are going on. One is the story about Jesus and what Jesus is doing and how he's interacting with people and the miracles and all that great story. The other thing is that Mark's gospel is the shortest, by the way. And so there are things in the other gospels that Mark doesn't include. There are things in Mark that, for example, John doesn't include. So one of the things we want to do, if we want to get an accurate idea of what is being communicated here, is not only what is going on with Jesus and the people around him, but why did Mark tell the story in the way he did? Why did he include this story? And why did he say it the way he said it? And
right.
And asking that question helps us. I think it kind of opens up the narrative so that it makes even not more sense, but it deepens our understanding of what is going on.
Right. These ancient people, they weren't just like so overcome by the narrative of Jesus that they're just writing everything down. That this is everything they have and they're just trying to dump it on paper because, oh my gosh, they don't want to forget. That there's an intentionality to what they're writing and why and how they're telling the story. One of the ways that's highlighted is at the end of John's gospel. He says there's probably not enough libraries and all the books in all the world to write down everything that Jesus said and did. And so the implication is that these are ones that are chosen for a reason. And so we're going to break down some units of thought into something that we might reference as a pericope so that we can follow which units of thought the author is kind of building up. So what's the author saying in these units of thought and in these chunks? And who is the author speaking to? And we'll talk a little bit about the two dominant audiences there, the Roman audience and the Jewish audience, and how they may have taken a writing like Mark and what Mark was saying. And we also know that Mark was someone who spent time with Paul, and he was also spent time with Peter. And was he Barnabas's nephew?
Barnabas's cousin. Barnabas was,
right.
As far as we know, Paul's first partner in ministry, traveling companion, and Mark was a part of that first, what we sometimes refer to as missionary journey. So Mark was very well acquainted with both Paul and Peter.
Right. I've heard some people suggest that maybe Mark is explaining a lot of the things that Paul would have explained, but using a lot of the stories from his experience with Peter.
Yeah.
But, yeah. And so if we start with this first pericope, and I'm just going to read this, and maybe we can, explain how these cultures might have taken these phrases, this Roman and Jewish culture, and help us identify, like you've said, we're listening to one half of a phone conversation. And so who's on the other end of the line? And the things that are being said help us identify who they're talking to. I used to do that with my mom. Is that grandma and grandpa? Are we going to go out of town and, am I going to get spoiled? Or is this just a friend from work? Who's mom talking to?
When she was on the phone.
Right. So here we go. That was back in the day when phones were used dials and were connected to the wall.
Connected to the wall, yeah.
All right.
You're dating yourself, Bob.
I know. Well, I didn't say how old I was.
That'll come out, though. All
right. Still dated myself. I know it. All right. So here we go. Mark 1:1. And I'm going to read, this is from the NIV. The beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. So I know other passages render that instead of the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, they say the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So why does that get translated a little? What's going on here?
Well, every discipline has its in-house, insider kind of language. So, medicine does this, theology does it, and churches do it. So we've gotten used to the idea or the word gospel, and it's okay to use that, but we have to remember that that's simply an Old English word for good news. The New American Standard Translation renders it the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so I think it's good for us to, maybe look at a couple of translations and, understand that the word gospel there means good news. So whatever else happens in this narrative, that ultimately the story is good news.
Yeah. Then Mark is trying to tell us something that he perceives to be good news.
Right. And then he says Jesus the Messiah, or Jesus. Sometimes people have gotten the idea that his first name was Jesus and his last name was Christ. I used to think that when I was growing up. But Christ is a title, and it means the anointed one, which is the equivalent of the Old Testament Messiah. And the anointed one was the king. So there's so much in this opening sentence that Mark is identifying Jesus, the historical Jesus, as the king that Israel had been waiting for and expecting for thousands of years. And Mark is saying, he's the one.
Yeah, the time has come. And so to set this a little bit into the setting of what these people were experiencing in their everyday life, that this was a tumultuous time in Jerusalem, and the surrounding world knew that it was a tumultuous time, that there were governors, Roman governors, who essentially ruled over Jerusalem, that there might have been a local king, but there's someone that king answers to who's a representative of Rome.
Right. The Romans had a practice of allowing rulers, local rulers, that functioned as administrators of the Roman government, and they let them call themselves king, but they really weren't the king. So, like when we run across King Herod, he was really a functionary of the Roman government who called himself a king.
Right, and the common Jewish citizen who was, that wouldn't have been necessarily something that everyone was excited about, Herod or the Roman governor.
No, Herod was not a well-liked person, and the Romans were hated by a very many. I don't know. I mean, don't have any numbers, but a lot of the Jewish people over whom Rome ruled really hated the fact that non-Jewish people were trampling their holy land, their holy inheritance from God. And the Messiah was the one who was going to come and cast out the unbelievers and reestablish the kingdom of David and reconnect the people to God. We in America, we talk about this separation of church and state. That's really a foreign concept around the world. In fact, even to this day, the Queen of England is the head of the Church of England, and they don't see any problem with that. France is officially a Catholic nation. So you might say, well, where has that impacted their public policy? But if you go to England or France or Germany or any of these countries, you talk about, well, church and state need to be separate. People just scratch their heads and look at you and say, why? And the same thing was true in ancient Israel. They wanted to return to, a theocracy, to use a term. They wanted to get back to the idea that they had a human king, but that ultimately he answered not to someone in Rome who was an unbeliever, but ultimately he answered to God himself. And that's who the Messiah was expected to be.
Right. And so there's all this tension with that idea that this is the Holy Land. This is land that was divinely given to these people. That's their worldview. This is our holy land that has been given to us, and some interloper is telling us what for about it. And there was this fortress, the Antonia Fortress, that was tall enough that the Roman soldiers in the Antonia Fortress, they could just look down on the temple courts where the Jews were practicing their faith, their sacrifices, and trying to honor their God. And here is these Roman soldiers keeping an eye on them. And that's highly offensive. Here in God's holy city, here are these pagan soldiers watching us while we worship. And they were, uniquely monotheistic, these ancient Jews. There's only one God. And so, these Romans had all these various gods, and they're worshiping the one true God. And here these Romans are standing over, keeping an eye on them.
Right. And there was a lot of tension between the person on the street and the Roman government and the Roman representatives of the Roman government. And the the Jews were so strongly convicted of their faith. And I mean, there are certain things that were required of citizens in the Roman Empire that the Jews simply would not do. So the Romans made exceptions for them. The Romans said, okay, there are certain things that we require everybody else to do, but you get a pass because we don't want to fight that battle. Just do your job, pay your taxes, and everything will be fine. But there's this seething undercurrent among the Jews. And it's interesting that whenever there's a time of political oppression, the Jews have always looked to the time of the Messiah. If you remember the movie Fiddler on the Roof, there was terrible persecution by the Russian government of the Jews. And that was the setting of the movie. And the main character said, wouldn't this be a wonderful time for the Messiah to come? So Jesus comes into this situation in which a lot of Jews are expecting the Messiah. And there were a lot of people running around during this period of time saying, I am the Messiah. And we'll talk about this as we get into the book. But Jesus sort of backs away from all that and doesn't say, I'm the Messiah, send me your offering and I'll give you a special prayer cloth or I'll give you a special blessing. He gets away from all that. But Mark clearly says, this is the Messiah.
Right. So that's to the Jewish culture, if you don't believe Jesus is a Messiah, that's a controversial statement. But most likely we think that Mark was written to a more Roman audience about Jesus.
Right. Throughout Mark's work, you see him, he'll talk about some Jewish custom or practice, and then he'll explain it. If he was writing to a Jewish audience, he wouldn't have had to explain it. So it's clear that Mark's primary audience is non-Jewish.
Right. So these are people who are also, we forget. I mean, we look at the New Testament, we can just go read these 27, letters and writings, and we learn about Jesus. But Mark was probably written in what, say, the mid-50s CE AD, somewhere in there.
Give or take.
Right?
Give or take, yeah.
Give or take. Yeah. So likely not before that. So here's this time from when Jesus dies, and here's maybe near a couple decades where people are discussing and following Jesus. And they're being taught about who Jesus is from these 39 documents that are found in the Christian Old Testament, these 39 writings that are collected into what we call the Old Testament. And they weren't probably doing that in this kind of a proof texty way. I know I have a lot of respect for various authors who, write titles, evidence that demands a verdict and things like that. But they weren't trying to prove a case in court. They were trying to explain the character and the nature of the Messiah that had come. And so it's likely that this audience was not only non-Jewish, but had a high familiarity with books like Daniel or Isaiah or some of these other books, and were coming to understand who Jesus was from this other narrative. So then Mark comes in and fills in a lot of this information and connects a lot of these things. And so for this ancient audience, to bring up some of this background narrative, really fills in a lot of that. Now, there's this other idea here with this non-Jewish audience, the idea of the Son of God. If you've never read about the Caesar cult in Rome, what would happen with a Caesar? Julius Caesar was venerated as a deity, and Augustus, his great nephew, some 100 years later,
something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah, I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, he was venerated posthumously as a deity. And so the thing was, if you had a successor who liked you, or the people liked you, then the Senate would, venerate you as a deity at your posthumously, and there was this after you died, and there would be this ceremony, and they burn your body, and then it was said that your spirit ascended to heaven, and you became a god. And so there's this implication of the Roman Caesar that he is like a god. And with this Roman narrative, you have this, this idea of people like Hercules who meet the challenges of life and ascend to deity, and that's a value. So within Rome, maybe Caesar's maybe not worshipped as a deity during his lifetime, but probably after he dies. But then within the broader Roman Empire, there were places where, Caesar might as well be God. So the guy ruling the Roman Empire, which is ruling that whole Mediterranean area during this era, has this connection to deity.
Right. And it was not unheard of for someone to be called God's son, or a son of the gods, or a son of one of the gods in Rome. But to call someone the Son of God could be very offensive in terms of the Roman belief system. Mark is making kind of a radical statement here, that Jesus isn't like Caesar or like some great person. He is the Son of God, not one of the gods, but the one true God. Because Mark, being a Jew, he didn't believe that there were lots of gods. He believed there was one true God. So this is a powerful statement to a non-Jewish audience, that Jesus is unique, that he is something that exceeds even the greatest of the Caesars.
Right. Yeah.
And then if I could comment on, as a Jew writing this, or as a Jew reading this, in their thinking, God has no relatives. God is a solitary soul, unique being, and he doesn't have a son. So that Mark's statement here is really kind of pulling back the curtain on the divine nature, the unique divine nature of Jesus. So if I have a son, he shares my nature. He's a human being. And if God has a son, he shares God's nature, which makes him a divine being. So this is we just kind of gloss through this, but this is a powerful treatise about Jesus. It's as earth-shattering to their world as the Declaration of Independence was in 1776.
Right. Yeah, and this really hits both of those cultures. For the Jew, Messiah is not just going to save the nation of Israel. He's going to rule over all the nations. So the anointed one of Israel is the king over everyone, and he's the Son of God. This is, to all audiences, this is attention-getting and controversial. And he also starts this with the beginning, which, because this is written in Greek, and this ancient common Greek, it really doesn't, word order doesn't matter like it does in English, where you have to start with a certain word. You don't end phrases with prepositions like I do all the time. But they don't have the same grammatical rules for us and all those grammar boring rules stuff. They could actually put the words in essentially any different order they want. So to start with arche, or the beginning, is also kind of becoming the title of his work. That has a deeper connection there, doesn't it, Everett?
Yeah, if you look at the book of Genesis, which begins what we call the Old Testament, that starts out with "in the beginning," and Mark is sort of echoing that vibe, if you will, by saying that this is the beginning of something new and unique. Now, saying that, though, it also ties it to the background and the faith that has gone before. So I guess in some ways you could say what Jesus is doing is a continuation of what God had been doing for thousands of years, but that this is also something new because Jesus is going to set things right now.
Right. The Messiah is going to come and right the problems that they had experienced.
Right. If I could make one grammatical note about something you said, Bob.
Yeah.
If we, in English, just jumbled up all the words in a major paragraph, it wouldn't make any sense. The reason you can kind of mix the words up in Greek is because they all have inclusions and endings that tie them to other words so that it still makes sense. It does make sense, even though the word order is not as significant as it is in English.
Right. It's not like you're decoding the language. It still makes sense because of the type of word you're using. So it's not like they got a bunch of a word jumble, and then the reason we have it is because they disassembled the jumble. It made sense to the ancient audience. They read the same thing we're reading in their own language. Right. Yeah, good point. All right, so when we come back, we're going to pick up this discussion of the controversy of Mark and what Mark's good news is.